There has, in the past 20 years, been a very concerted effort from the Australian government with bipartisan support, where the government has been actively seeking to recognise First Nations people in the Constitution. So, since the Howard government committed to constitutional recognition, we've had 6 parliamentary processes and 9 reports on the issue of what recognition could look like for First Nations people. So, there are many different forms of constitutional recognition which fall on a spectrum of symbolic to substantive. And so hopefully Shireen will talk a little bit more about that later. Symbolic though is, like a change in the wording of the preamble to an introduction, and substantive is like a voice. So in the early 2000s, there was a push towards symbolic recognition, and the work towards current processes and substantive reform have been building in momentum in earnest since approximately 2011. So a key turning point in this process took place in 2015 when First Nations leaders issued the Uluru Statement to Prime Minister Tony Abbott and opposition leader Bill Shorten. The Uluru Statement rejected all symbolistic forms of recognition which had been floated throughout these processes in the earlier 2000s, and instead called for substantive change decided by Indigenous people through a dialogue process. So shortly after, the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull established the Referendum Council with bipartisan support. Could you please flick to the next slide? So in 2016, the Indigenous Steering Committee, through the vehicle of the Referendum Council, designed an unprecedented dialogue process the first to actually ask First Nations people what meaningful recognition meant to them. 12 regional dialogues were held over the course of 2016 and 2017. The dialogues were intended to give a voice to the voiceless. Each dialogue had approximately 100 in attendance. However, there was an open door policy. 60% from First Nations traditional owner groups, 20% from community organisations, and 20% of key individuals. So, I think it's the next slide, thank you. Now, the dialogues followed a structured and principled process that canvassed legal and policy issues and political vitality. They considered what the options for reform were and whether they would work. So you can see here at the dialogues, so they had civics education, so what the Constitution is, the different types of reform that might be on the table, how political legal institutions work, and then they was then split up to canvass the different reform proposals through a comprehensive legal explanation and discussion on the political vitality. The delegates were, to assess these proposals and prioritise each option according to the views of their region. So this slide shows the outcome of those discussions. So you can see that something, such as insignificant a statement of acknowledgement was pretty well rejected. And you can see that a voice to Parliament was overwhelmingly supported. We then had agreement making, and coming behind that was the provision of the racial discrimination. So, next slide please. So in May 2017, we had representatives from each of the 12 dialogues, and then they attended the National Convention at Uluru to finalise their calls for reform. So it wasn't to have a debate and with new things on the table. It was to rehash, I suppose, what was discussed and the general consensus that have come out of those dialogue processes. So in that, a set of guiding principles were distilled from the records of meetings at the first regional dialogues. These guiding principles provided a framework for the assessment and deliberation on reform proposals. The National Convention, again, how I mentioned, it didn't open the work that had been done in the dialogues. Rather, the task of the National Convention was to bring together the outcomes from the dialogues in order to arrive at a consensus. So the guiding principles that you can see there up for deliberation was it does not diminish Aboriginal sovereignty and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty. It involves substantive structural reform. It advances self-determination and the standards established under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It recognises the status and rights of First Nations. It tells the truth of our history. It does not foreclose on future advancement. It does not waste the opportunity for reform. It provides a mechanism for First Nations agreement making and has the support of First Nations and does not interfere with the current and future legal arrangements. So they then assessed these reforms against these principles, and the voice to Parliament and agreement making became the clear priorities. So it was on the Saturday night that each of the dialogues, of the dialogues, when the Uluru Statement from the Heart was written, and it was read for the first time at a special ceremony on the Sunday, which was included in the Referendum Council report. Next slide, thank you. So this is the Uluru, that was what we needed, thank you. So that's the actual document, and the intention was it's not something to be sitting on a shelf gathering dust. I've been lucky enough to be in the presence of this beautiful document, which is probably the size of that picture over there, and it's such a powerful and beautiful artwork and gift. Now, I wanted to take a moment, I think, maybe to go through, and I'm trying to be conscious of time, so Juanita, you just give me a little wave. I think it's really important to read the statement because some of us haven't had the opportunity to read it yet. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This, our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we're the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our own destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart was issued to the Australian people rather than the government and outlines two sequenced reforms, voice and Makarrata.